thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's our Dyslexia and Dyspraxia Releasing Untapped Potential webinar as part of our neurodiversity webinar series. I will just run through a few little bits of housekeeping before handing over. So the session is being recorded and you will get, it's Friday today, so you'll get an email on Monday with a link to the recording. Feel free, so you can watch it again, or if you have to jump off early or anything like that. But also please feel free to share that link to colleagues and contacts, anyone that you think might find it useful. You're not visible during the webinar, just to let you know that. So if you are, you can happily eat your lunch comfortably. We can't see you at all and no one else can see you. We can just see the hosts. So, we make time for a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, so the sort of last 15 minutes, so that you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a couple of important tabs. So the Q&A tab, if you've got any questions for our hosts with regards to the actual webinar topic, please drop them in there and we'll try and get as many of those answered as possible towards the end. We've also got a chat tab, which we find has been really engaging throughout our webinars as well. If you've got any experiences that you want to share or just any comments throughout the webinar, please drop it in the chat. We've seen some great kind of tips and conversations going on in there in our webinars. Our webinars are a taster of commercial products that we do. So we do run these training and awareness sessions within organisations. We don't actually send out the slide deck, but as I say, we do send out the link to the recording, so you can get everything from there as well. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to our lovely hostesses. So Lizzie, over to you first. Thank you.
That's super. Thank you, Nicole. So I'm Lizzie and I'm one of the Workplace Adjustments Disability Advisors and Assessors. That was a mouthful. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about kind of assistive technology and other aspects of dyslexia and dyspraxia that we can kind of support with. So I'll pass you over to Alice.
Thank you, Lizzie. Yeah, I'm Alice. I also have a very long job title. I am one of the training and consultancy specialists here at Marigold Health. I'm the neurodiversity specialist on the team. It's not because I've got a degree in it or anything. It's because I'm part of a particularly neurodivergent family. So meaning it's something that I've been aware of for my entire life, before I even knew that neurodiversity or neurodivergent was a word. So Lizzie and I are really looking forward to this webinar today. So just sit back, relax, and we'll rock and roll, I guess. So where to begin? Now, the aim of today's session is to develop your awareness of dyslexia and dyspraxia. So we'll begin with some facts and figures. Who doesn't love a stat on a Friday afternoon? We'll also look at some of the strengths that are associated with these conditions, as well as the potential challenges that people might face. Lizzie will then explore the world of assistive technology, and we'll end by looking at some of the simple changes that could help a colleague with one of these conditions, and also some questions that you should use, and just to find out really how you can help a colleague succeed at work. So we'll start with dyslexia, okay, a condition that people feel like they know everything about, but is that necessarily the case? Now, it's estimated that there's about 10% of the population who are affected by dyslexia to some extent, but there are places that report the figure as significantly higher than that. It could be as high as 17 or 20%. But dyslexia is thought of as a continuum, so people can be mildly, moderately, or severely affected, and it's thought that approximately 4% of the population are severely impacted by their dyslexia. Now, dyslexia is a difference in an individual's ability to learn and process information, and that is, of course, going to produce strengths and challenges. It isn't linked to intelligence at all, but it can make learning difficult, especially with traditional teaching methods, shall we say. But it's a lot more than just issues with reading and writing. So dyslexia really affects how the brain works, right? And it creates this potential for a range of really useful skills, especially in the modern workplace. So it's associated with things like being curious, being inquisitive, imaginative, creative, and that's going to lead to strengths in lots of different areas of creativity. And that includes things like being artistic, being musical, being talented at sport, but also things like being entrepreneurial or inspiring or leading others, okay? So people with dyslexia have this ability to be observant and focus on details and even analyze really complex information and just notice when things are out of place. So that means that they're great at things like troubleshooting or fault identifying ability. And that explains really why things like the security services have specifically employed dyslexic people to spot events when it comes to things like issues with data, code cracking, that sounds really exciting, and just generally solving really complex problems. Because people with dyslexia can see beyond detail, and it's called this strategic view. Okay, so you can have this strategic view of a subject or of a problem. So rather than looking at things in a sequence, we can look at things simultaneously, or as a whole, or in this alternative way. And that enables people to identify interrelationships and similarities between ideas. It helps us to see patterns and information and trends in data. So those strengths are of particular significance in fields like science or maths or even IT. Now, dyslexic people have an ability to learn through experiences. Now, controversially, those can be real experiences or imagined experiences. Now, they might also recall information as maybe like a story, with information linking together rather than being this random set of data, facts, and figures. So this episodic memory and narrative reasoning is what it's called, can help them integrate contextual information a lot better. Okay, so we can see how it is a significant advantage because lots of people who are dyslexic have this ability to visualize in this three-dimensional, multi-story, sounds very sci-fi, I know, but it's this image that actually allows their thoughts to evolve and grow as more information is added. It's really important about the context. Okay, so visual thinking is thought to be a hell of a lot faster than verbal thinking alone. And research has actually shown that lots of people with dyslexia are better at manipulating 3D images in their mind. Now, that lends itself to things like design, engineering, construction, even architecture, because the brain is set up for being analytical and logical. Use the patterns or concepts that have been identified to see a way through a problem, actually evaluating the evidence, maybe exploring the possibilities, and then making those balanced and informed decisions. Because people with dyslexia are usually good problem solvers. Now, often that's developed because they've had to find different ways to learn or had to find different ways to solve problems because, like I said, traditional learning might have been difficult for them, and normal, quote unquote, normal solutions aren't necessarily as effective when your brain thinks differently. So that can include things like finding out information from different sources and making entirely different connections to a neurotypical person. Also stuff like being able to visualize potential outcomes and finding new ways to complete tasks. Dyslexic people also have a really high level of empathy, to be honest, for others. And that can come from two sources, I would say. Firstly, personal experiences. So if you've got personal experiences of a struggle, that can give you an understanding of others who are also potentially having difficulties. But secondly, there's this level of intuition and just being able to read a situation which allows you to understand what's happening from another person's point of view. Okay, so dyslexia impacts the skills that are involved in accurate, fluent reading, writing, and spelling. And that's what most people think of as dyslexia. And it is true. So it involves difficulty in dealing with things like sounds of words. So it's especially hard to learn to use phonics to read word. And that's where we all start when we're kids. So it can affect your ability to recall or process a list of words or numbers, or even just to remember instructions. Now, they might also have difficulty with elements of written work. So that could be issues with spelling and grammar, maybe having poor handwriting. Might find it hard to structure written communication as well, and having those just a difficulty expressing ideas both in verbal and written communication. So you might notice a distinct contrast between what someone expresses verbally and what they're actually able to put down on paper. Now, they are likely to experience some issues with reading. So reading fluently, or maybe a reluctance to read out loud, maybe struggling to understand or learn new words, or even misreading words. And some people will have a visual sensitivity to text, where the words, actually seem to move or blur on the page when, they're not moving, but that's what the sensitivity is causing. One thing that is interesting, though, is a lesser known effect of dyslexia is the difficulties that it can cause with processing and memory. So those things are often characterized by short-term or working memory problems, which can mean it takes longer for someone to learn things, especially in that traditional way where things are taught or things are trained. And it might not be straightforward for people to apply rules to different situations. So people might need extra time to maybe respond to questions or express themselves. They might have difficulty understanding verbal instructions. So lots of dyslexic people can also struggle with things like organization and time and planning, and that can lead to difficulties with sequences of tasks or following instructions. People might seem underprepared for meetings or events just because they haven't been able to order their thoughts. Now, some people might also have a disorganized work area or keep losing things. I feel personally attacked by that comment. I'm very glad you can't see my desk right now. Dyslexia can make planning and prioritizing and multitasking stressful and even more difficult than usual. So some people might struggle to meet deadlines, especially if there's a long project or if it involves complex tasks, which haven't been broken down into those bite-sized manageable chunks. And they can also have difficulties like problems navigating, getting lost, and even mixing up left to right. I'm still very reliant on making the L on my left hand so that I know which is which. But that was us looking at dyslexia. We've got two conditions for us to look at today. So if we move on to dyspraxia for a moment, dyspraxia is also known as developmental coordination disorder. It's quite hard to say when you try and say it quickly. And both of those names are perfectly accepted terms. Ultimately, it comes down to individual preference. What's not accepted, however, is the former name for the condition, and that was called clumsy child syndrome. I don't really need to explain why clumsy child syndrome is not necessarily an appropriate diagnosis, but we will look at that shortly. Now, I'll be calling it dyspraxia for the purposes of this webinar. So dyspraxia affects motor coordination, and it's thought to be caused by a disruption in the way that messages from the brain are transmitted to the body. So there's a wire that's not quite connecting, like when you've got to hold your iPhone wire in a certain way, otherwise it won't connect. There's something that's missing potentially. Now, it affects a person's ability to perform movements, and that could be in smooth and coordinated ways. So someone with dyspraxia might have associated difficulties with things like speech, language, and depth perception, and also thought as well. So it's thought that around 6% of the population have dyspraxia, with 2% being severely impacted by their condition. It does occur across all intellectual abilities. It's got absolutely nothing to do with intellect. And there's a similar percentage to dyslexia, and actually significantly more than autism, even though it's much less well known. I'm a trainer, is what I do for a living, and you'd be surprised at the amount of people who don't know what dyspraxia is. They just haven't heard of it before, which is surprising given how common it is. Now, as we saw with dyslexia, the different ways that the dyspraxic brain works does create challenges, and we will come to that, but it also produces these alternative ways of thinking. And that can, again, it can lead to creativity and excellent imagination and original thinking. We've got things like good holistic and strategic thinking. It might be analytical and observant, have a good eye for detail. Sounds like I'm reeling off a job application that someone's seen on LinkedIn, because these are really desired skills, After managing the challenges that dyspraxia can present, people might develop really highly valued personality characteristics. So they might be thorough and methodical and show determination and resilience and motivation. So things that we're all looking for. You know, you're likely to be open-minded, considerate, patient, empathetic. You know, like I said, with dyspraxia, it can affect elements of coordination between the brain and the body. And dyspraxia affects fine and gross motor skills, but it's distinctly different from any other mobility difficulties, like cerebral palsy, for example. You don't grow out of dyspraxia. So years ago, like I said, it was called clumsy child syndrome. That was an official diagnosis, but that suggested that it was only children that would have dyspraxia and it would go away as they got older. But that's not the case. So the effects of dyspraxia remain the same as you get older. It's just that people tend to learn how to manage their difficulties better with time because they've lived in that body for longer. They know themselves for longer. So it might be easier for some people to manage. Now, it can affect those fine motor skills, things like grip and dexterity, sometimes making things like writing or operating machinery quite difficult. But it can affect the gross motor skills as well. So that's things like balance and body awareness. And that can mean that someone might have an unusual gait and they might bump into things, they might drop things more often, you know. Speech and language can be impacted, and difficulties might include slow reading, or misreading and misunderstanding information, as well as pronunciation issues. They might find copying or proofreading difficult, and sometimes problems with visual perception as well. So that's difficulties focusing on information or blurring of vision. And you can understand why dyslexia and dyspraxia get banded together sometimes. It's not because they both start with a D. There are just some common challenges and also common strengths that are associated with both of the conditions. So some dyspraxic people might have a heightened sensitivity to light, okay, and also things like temperature, even sound and touch. So sensory overload can be a big problem for a person with dyspraxia, and it can affect your concentration and memory as well. And that can make it really difficult for people to maintain attention and focus, especially if there are distractions or interruptions. I always think whenever I say distractions and interruptions, I want to cue my dog barking. I think that's the perfect time for the dog to start barking and distract me. Multitasking is also a big problem, and even returning to a task after there's been a break, because there's like a bit of a short circuit in the brain, so it's hard to get back on track essentially. And there can be this knock-on effect in someone's ability to stay on track with work, and with that, someone can experience excessive tiredness. There are so many things that we can consider when it comes to barriers. We've got organizational skills can be affected. That can have difficulty in things like planning, prioritizing, meeting deadlines. You know, all of these things also means that communication and social issues can be a bit difficult for a person with dyspraxia, particularly if a person's required to answer questions really quickly. So that can lead to confidence and self-esteem issues, and that can be shown by avoiding social situations, doubting your own abilities, especially in work, you know, and being concerned about new activities and change. So you might see some emotional symptoms as a direct response, really, of some of the physical symptoms that a person with dyspraxia is experiencing. Thing is, knowing what these conditions are is important. Yeah, of course it is. But what's more important is actually considering what can be done to support people with these conditions or any other neurodiverse conditions in the workplace. You know, if you're part of a company that employs more than 15 people, then statistically, there will be a neurodivergent person amongst you. It's that simple. So I'm going to hand you over to Lizzie, who's going to talk about some of the practical things that you can actually consider to help. So Lizzie, take it away.
That's super. Thank you very much, Alice. So yeah, I'm going to focus first on assistive technology. We're going to look at what kind of services are offered by us. And then we're going to look a little bit deeper into what we mean when we say strategy coaching. So first and foremost, assistive technology. What is it? What does it mean? So it refers to any kind of software or equipment that is there to assist with some of these barriers. So we can kind of split it into three. So we can say no tech, low tech, and high tech. So no tech, we will look into these in a little bit more detail shortly, but no tech, we're thinking about things like coloured overlays or maybe coloured paper, coloured pens even. Low tech, maybe a timer. You could just literally set a timer on your phone, or you might have a little timer in front of you. High tech, we're looking at more kind of deep software such as like dictation and AI assisted technologies. So the important thing to note here is that the technology we're going to talk about is assistive. It is not artificial intelligence. It's only there to support. It's not going to completely resolve any difficulties. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So with that being said, we're going to look at assistive technology from both the pro angle and the con angle. We're going to take a really realistic view of them. So first and foremost, then, what can we do to support with reading? So as I say, a no tech version of this kind of support, we're looking at things like coloured overlays and reading rulers. So the pros here, very, very easy to implement and very cheap to implement as well. So you can literally pick them up off Amazon. It's very easy to change the colour of your paper and provide lots of different colours for people to try. And the thing that these help with is kind of that visual sensitivity that Alice was speaking about. So some of the blurring that people experience and the visual stress whilst reading. Often people will find a colour that suits them better, that actually reduces some of that visual sensitivity and makes it easier to read. Not that many cons on that one, in my opinion. It's a really simple, easy way to resolve a difficulty. I would say probably from a con perspective, it's not going to help everyone. Some people with dyslexia and dyspraxia don't have that visual sensitivity, and it doesn't really matter what colour paper they're using or what colour overlay they're putting over the top of it. So it's not going to work for everyone. So the next one is text-to-speech software. So there are a couple of different brands and a couple of different softwares that we tend to look at. One of those is Text Help Read and Write. Another one is Clara Read. Go back, Nicole, please. Another one's Clara Read. And so essentially, this software is designed to read out loud to you. Okay. Now, I'm going to focus quite heavily here on read and write. But essentially, I know there's a read aloud function in Microsoft Word, and that is brilliant for a lot of people. It's really useful. Read and write specifically has some other aspects of that reading support that people can find really helpful. So it allows you to kind of slow down how quick someone's reading. Equally, it speeds it up as well. And you can increase the pauses between words, which can be really, really useful. It also highlights as it reads so that you can follow along as it's reading aloud to you. And those highlights can be put into lots of different colours. So pros and cons on that. Pros, it's really useful for people who are able to process information when they hear it in an oral way rather than reading it. However, it's a very expensive software. And I think that is where we need to consider the fact that, you know, a lot of these assistive technologies have a high cost. It's one of those where we need to kind of weigh up how much difficulty someone's having, and if the difficulty is really significant and a text-to-speech software would help, fantastic, let's go for it. But we can try those coloured overlays initially to see how they get on. So third one is reading pens. Now, these are pretty snazzy. There is one called an OrCam, and an OrCam essentially has like a little laser, and you scan your page and it literally scans the whole thing and then reads it out loud to you. So it's pretty snazzy. It also comes with a very high price tag of around £3,000. So that is a very expensive solution. There are cheaper alternatives, something like the C Pen reader. So that also reads aloud to you, but you have to kind of highlight over what you would like it to read. But from a price perspective, it's a lot cheaper and it does do the same job. And I guess it depends how much physical reading someone is doing rather than digitally reading from a screen. So if we look at the next barrier, writing. So as Alice said, difficulties with writing, difficulties expressing yourself, and obviously difficulties with spelling and grammar. So first and foremost, let's have a think about dictation software. So I'm thinking here about something called Dragon, or alternatively, there's also something called TalkType, both of which are very good at what they do. So dictation essentially does what it says on the tin. You read, you speak what you actually want it to type for you. Massive pro there, that actually often people with dyslexia are very, very good at verbalizing their thoughts. It's putting it into writing where the challenge comes in. However, with something like Dragon, you are going to have to also dictate your punctuation, which is a really challenging skill to learn for anyone, neurotypical or neurodivergent, but can actually be really, really tricky for someone with dyslexia and dyspraxia, because it disrupts the flow of speech by saying comma and full stop, question mark. So that can be quite tricky. Now, TalkType, alternatively, has an auto punctuation feature, which is really, really good and it works very, very well, but it doesn't really take into account natural human pauses where you're kind of having a think. So it will start punctuating as you go, whilst you're actually just stopping mid-sentence to have a think about how you want to complete that sentence. So again, both of these softwares, yes, they're really helpful. And for some people, they are absolutely invaluable. But it's really important to recognize that those softwares aren't artificially intelligent. So there are shortcomings within them, and they're not going to resolve all of those difficulties. What we tend to suggest is a combination approach. So we would say something like dictation, and then we would add that or combine that with an AI spelling and grammar checker. So something like Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid, both of which are very, very good. And they are they have like an artificially intelligent operating system within them that will look for grammatical errors, it will look for spelling errors, and the beauty of it will also give you alternative ways of saying things. So often, you know what you want to say, you get it on the paper and it doesn't sound as good as you want it to, basically. So Pro Writing Aid and Grammarly would rewrite that for you and give you like an alternative rephrase based on some of the conditions that you tell it. So if you want it formal, if you want it more informal, more professional, and it will take that into account and rewrite it. It's really, really useful. Now, with Grammarly and Pro Writing Aid, one of the biggest cons is that they don't always pass organisational security checks. So unfortunately, although they're absolutely brilliant, they're not always operationally feasible for a lot of organisations. And that's to do with GDPR and kind of where their servers are based. I won't go into massive amounts of detail about that, but although they're really good, you have to accept that sometimes they're just not feasible. So looking at a mind mapping software then, there's lots to choose from. You can look at MindView, Mind Manager, Inspiration. There's an absolute wide range, okay? And the beauty of mind mapping and how it helps with writing is it helps people express what they want to get on a page in a visual way. So often people with dyslexia and dyspraxia are very visual learners, and their brain kind of processes information in this really visual way. So mind mapping software allows you to create these mind maps and put a structure in place using that visual representation. Something like MindView, for example, then allows you to type into each and every bubble separately. Okay, so you can kind of write your bit about point A and then close it, so you're not thinking about it, it's not confusing you. And then you'd write your point about your paragraph about point B, and then at the end you can export it into an actual full structured report, which is really, really useful. The other thing with mind mapping software, it can help with like organization, because you can essentially create things like Gantt charts within there, timelines. There's absolutely tons. So from a pros and cons angle then, I've given you a massive list of pros there, right? But if we look at the cons, not everyone has access to the mind mapping software, right? So you're then having to export it into, for example, a picture or an image and send it across to someone else. They will then look at it, but they can't make any edits unless they've also got the software. Okay, so it's not very cohesive if it's something that you're looking to do as a team. The other aspect is the cost again, so it is quite expensive. But what I will say is, depending on what you need from that mind mapping software would depend on the type of software we would be recommending. So Inspiration doesn't have the ability to make things like those timelines or the Gantt charts. But if that's not what you're using it for, then actually you'd be better off with something like Inspiration. So moving on to my next one. So handwriting as a barrier. This one's my favorite because I love a funky, weird pen. So handwriting tends to be quite difficult for people with dyspraxia. You tend to find that people with dyspraxia actually struggle to hold a pen in the correct way. And when I say the correct way, what I mean is the ergonomically sound way. Okay, there is no real correct way of holding a pen. It's just however you hold it. However, because they might have trouble holding a pen in an ergonomically sound way, they end up with quite a lot of hand pain and calluses, that sort of thing on your hands. Your handwriting can be quite messy as well. So we would be looking at something really simple, and we'd be looking at the type of pen that you're using. Okay, so there's some really weird and funky pens, which are fairly cheap. I mean, they're a little bit more expensive than your average Bic, but you can get one for like a £5. Okay, now they're brilliant. I really like them, but they can take some getting used to. Okay, so if somebody's only ever written with a standard Bic, they might find it difficult to then start writing with this weird funky pen. So it might take some getting used to. Okay. The other aspect of it is that some of them actually make your handwriting worse, if I'm honest. So I have a fancy wishbone pen that's designed for dyspraxia and arthritis, and it looks fantastic, and my handwriting is unreadable with it. Okay. So one of the biggest cons here is the fact that until you try these pens, you actually don't know whether they're going to be helpful or not. So it's a little bit of trial and error. So pen grips, and I know Alice absolutely hates the picture I've chose here, but it's one of my favorites. So the pen grip is designed purely to add to a standard pen and make it more comfortable for you to hold. Okay, so this one here, it's essentially a bit of sponge, and you are holding onto the sponge rather than holding onto the pen directly. Now that combats some of those grip strength difficulties. Okay, so it makes it easier to hold on to the pen, and it also makes it easier to control the pen. Okay, which again, you don't know whether it's going to help until you've tried it. You can kind of get very sort of cheap ones just off Amazon, just to give them a try, see if they help. And I would say with these ones, yes, you're not sure if it's going to help, but they're a cheap way of helping you with your handwriting. And then writing slopes. So a writing slope is essentially an angled surface that you can write on. Now, again, it all comes down to this ergonomically sound position when you're writing, which is really, really tricky for someone with dyspraxia particularly. Okay, so you tend to see a lot of shoulder pain, wrist pain from the angle that this person is writing in order to handwrite. A writing slope kind of puts you in a sounder position, okay, and combats some of those aches and pains that you're getting, right? So again, you're not sure whether they're going to help until you've tried them. But what I will say is this is the sort of thing that you can kind of throw together a little bit at home to give it a try. Okay, so everybody's got a hardback book, I'm sure. And essentially, you put a hardback book at an angle on the table, place it against something, you've got a writing slow. Okay, you can try it out, see how it feels. If you find it really useful, then you can kind of look at an actual writing slow. So, next one then, we're going to look at memory and organization. So, I've thrown these two together purely because I think they go really well together. So, organization tends to be where you're kind of struggling to follow a plan or to plan accurately, especially over long periods of time. And then memory plays into that because you're missing things, because I don't know, it's not due for another 3 weeks or 3 months or whatever. So it kind of gets lost somewhere along the way. So these ones are quite high tech that we're going to look at. So smart pens and tablets. So I'm sure you've probably seen the Kindle Scribe that's being advertised really heavily at the moment on Amazon. So there's the Kindle Scribe, there's also the Apple Pen, Apple Pencil even, and the iPad. And the one that most people with a neurodivergent condition tend to like is the Remarkable. Okay. So essentially, this allows people to handwrite and keep their notes all in one place, all within this tablet. Okay, so it allows you to organize your notes more successfully. So you're not writing in 20 different notebooks and then you can't remember where you've written it, or you've written in 20 different notebooks and then you never look at them again, which is my go-to. So with a Remarkable or something similar, everything is all placed in one position, so you can kind of organize it and you're not going to lose things. So from a con perspective, again, it's quite an expensive thing, and not everyone gets on that well with them. So yes, it's designed to feel like your handwriting. It doesn't always feel exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to really, really quickly run through now because I'm conscious of time. So task managers, so you've probably heard of Asana and Trello, and just the list is endless. Okay, they all do pretty much the same thing, but what I would say is Microsoft To Do is an inbuilt task manager within Microsoft, so it's completely free as long as you've got kind of Microsoft Office, and it does exactly the same thing in a really simple way. So you can kind of create lists with all your tasks in, and then you can add due dates and reminders and all sorts. You can attach it to your calendar and your emails. So it's a really free, usually, if you've got Office, way of managing those tasks rather than getting something like Asana and Trello, which, to be honest, you often don't need most of the aspects of it. And then finally, we've got assistive note takers. So this is something that will transcribe a meeting whilst you're in it, but you can actually make notes alongside those transcriptions. So we're thinking of things like Caption Ed or Glean, okay? And these are absolutely marvelous, but again, they can be quite expensive. They do help with that kind of multitasking and dual processing, like parallel processing. However, that doesn't work for everyone. So some people still find it quite difficult to make those notes during a meeting. So I'm going to really quickly talk to you about our kind of neurodiversity offering, and then we're going to briefly touch on strategy coaching before we move back to Alice. So our neurodiversity offering then, so we offer expert neurodiversity assessments. So these are workplace needs assessments. They are not diagnostic assessments, okay? And what we do within that is look at people's barriers and consider what we can support with, what recommendations we can give to help, okay? We also offer case management, so we can help from end to end, so from assessment to the point of all that support being put in place. We can also help with procurement and funding, so looking at things like access to work or other funding grants that might be available. And we offer strategy coaching or neurodiversity coaching. You've probably all heard of neurodiversity coaching before, but just to give you an idea of what it is, okay? So strategy coaching is essentially working with a specialist in neurodiversity to help you come up with ways, techniques, strategies that we can implement to actually make life a bit easier. And it's for anyone with kind of a neurodiverse condition, but it can also be useful for people with mental health. And the kinds of things that it covers, I'm going to give you a great big list. So it covers, sorry, Nicole, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, so it basically covers all of the barriers that Alice has kind of talked about to us today, okay? Often a strategy coach will be pulling on techniques and strategies from all kinds of areas to come up with ways that are going to work for you. And the beauty of it is that they will meet you more than once so that you can kind of review those strategies, look at what's working, what isn't, and adapt, okay? So it's not about just throwing resources or throwing strategies at you and expecting them to work. This person would then sit with you, figure out what's working, what isn't, how can we fix it, okay? So I'm going to give you a very, very quick look at what kind of strategies a coach might talk about, so a little bit of a taster. And I'm not going to go through all 4 because I'm very conscious of time. But just to give you an idea, if we look at the Pomodoro method, if anyone's ever heard of that. So the Pomodoro method is for focus and attention. And essentially, it's about using a timer where usually you go for 25 minutes, work solidly with a 5-minute break. And then it's a Pomodoro, you do 3 of those, and then you have a 45-minute break. So it's essentially a time management exercise, but it's helpful to help people with focus and concentration. And then my favorite is the Ohio technique. So that stands for only handle it once. So if you've got an email that's come in and it's something that you can deal with in that moment, do it, okay? Don't put it off till tomorrow. Don't look at it and say, oh, I'll answer that in a little while, because what's going to happen is you've sat and thought about that, okay? So you've said mentally, this is how I'm going to respond, but you haven't actioned it. So then when you come back to it later, you go through the whole thought process again before you action it, okay? So only handle it once. If you can handle it in that moment, do it, all right? So I am going to skip over Eisenhower and Absidy and pass you back to Alice, just purely on time today.
Thank you, Lizzie. You're very nice, being very conscious of time, and yet here I am still thinking about those icky pen grips that look like olives. I just can't help myself. The thought of them, just the sponginess. Ugh, no thank you, dim diolch. So I digress. There we are, looking at time, and I'm still here talking about pen grips. I think what you're talking about, Lizzie, is really important, because when we think about technology and adjustments and things like that, people often think about the big stuff, and the big stuff costs money and time and manpower, and it becomes slightly overwhelming. It's not about big changes. Most of the time it's not. There are often these little adaptations to our daily working lives and working practices that can make a world of difference for a neurodivergent person. Now, loads of the adjustments are simple, they're free, they're easy to implement, and in my opinion, many of these adjustments should just be commonplace and natural, because ultimately they're not going to put a neurotypical person at a disadvantage. All it's really going to do is level the playing field for a neurodivergent person. Okay, controversial, yet brave. So we're going to consider some of the things that you can do just to make life easier for the colleagues with dyslexia, dyspraxia, or frankly, any of the other conditions. I know we've focused on dyslexia and dyspraxia today, but in our other webinars and in our training courses, we talk about ADHD, autism, dyscalculia, Mears-Island syndrome. We cover everything, okay? So it's likely, as we've discussed, that some of the difficulties will be with reading and writing. So on the screen, you'll see some of the simple adjustments that you could make to reduce some potential difficulty that someone might be having. So, just to go through a few, try and give information in other ways. That might be flowcharts, diagrams, pictures, highlight your key points, make sure you actually give someone time to read through or complete the task. If you can, provide written material beforehand and also after a meeting. Yeah. And ideally, I've said it once, I'll say it again, you shouldn't make people read and write in front of others. It could be uncomfortable and stressful. That's not going to help the symptoms at all. It can be beneficial to help with any handwritten work. Yeah. So if you can support with things like proofreading or finding other options, as he spoke about some of those options, could you take a picture? Could you use a dictaphone? And go old school, back to basics. Give a gal a dictionary. Yeah, look at a spell checker, look at glossary of terms. All these things can be massively, massively helpful to someone who's presenting with a reading and writing barrier. There are other barriers that we've discussed though. So if we consider things like written information for a moment, if you're producing written material, how can it be made more accessible? Yeah. We think about the coloured paper. We've got the red and green films that Lizzie was talking about. Think about your font. Yeah, don't make it unnecessarily complicated. No one needs to read wingdings at the end of the day. Arial is fine. There's nothing wrong with Arial. The best font for you to probably use is Comic Sans, but please don't, because you'll be laughed out of a boardroom if you decide to do a presentation in Comic Sans. But it is very neuro-friendly as a font. Just use the right fonts that you can. At least size 12 to 14. It's the easiest to read. Use bullet points and numbering rather than essays. Okay, no one needs to read that continuous text. Give instructions clearly. Do's and don'ts. Yeah, absolutely love a do's and don'ts list. Put flowcharts, pictograms, graphics. Again, use everything that you can in your documentation. And for the love of everything that is holy, please avoid abbreviations and jargon. There's nothing wrong with plain English. Okay, just because you know what something means doesn't mean that everyone else is going to know what something means. And we live in a world where everyone seems to use abbreviations and jargon now. So strip it back to basics. We've spoken about organisation and processing. So if they're an issue, there's loads of things that you can do. I'm like Lizzie, love a diary. Got 20 of them, loads of them are blank. I'm afraid to start them because I don't necessarily go back, but I am very much a stationary gal through and through. So some people love diaries. Yeah, you might love a planner. You might love an alarm or a checklist, whatever it is that you need to do, support people with that, because it makes a massive difference when it comes to that connection between their brain and the rest of their body. People might benefit from planning time. So how are you going to start your day? How are you going to end your day? And can you break it down into tasks that are actually manageable and a lot easier to process? And some people might need help with that. Okay, they might need help prioritizing tasks or setting deadlines or needing extra time, and that's fine. If someone just needs a bit of breathing space, I can assure you breathing space is free. Right? Now, examples and templates can also be really useful. So can additional breaks. Yeah, I'm not saying someone needs to suddenly have more time in the day, but you can just make the breaks that you naturally have a bit shorter, so that you can take 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there, rather than a block of 30 minutes in one go. It's ultimately what's going to be beneficial to the person. All right. Memory was linked with organization. You are right, Lizzie. I think organization, memory, and processing go hand in hand together. Someone might benefit from training in alternative ways or shorter sessions. I know we've changed our training in times when 6 hours in one go is probably a bit too intense for someone. So how about 3 2-hour sessions with breaks in between? Yeah, it's simple. It really doesn't change things that much, but it allows a person's brain to process that info. Give someone material in advance of training or in advance of meetings, because it actually gives someone a foundation to build on. And check understanding, use those motivational interviewing techniques that are all built into us. So let's go back, let's recap, let's summarize, because it makes a huge difference. It also makes a difference to you if you're supporting someone who might have a barrier when it comes to processing and memory. Because you will know if something has been understood. So we're not necessarily going to lose lines of communication because we're all talking to each other like grown-ups, right? Think about the environment too. The environment's really important. So particularly when we consider dyslexia and dyspraxia as topics in and of themselves. I've spoken about how sensory processing can be an issue for someone. So you can minimize noise by adding things like soft furnishings. Yeah, if that's not possible as well, you can provide quiet spaces and remove unnecessary clutter. Yeah, I know everyone loves a leaflet and a poster, but if it's not necessary, those bright colors and patterns can really, really distract someone. And I very much know that this goes without saying, but it is a very good idea to make sure that there are no trip hazards. You would be surprised. People think it's absolutely fine. I'll put some tape over it. It's fine. Tape's not going to help you here, okay? If someone has got balance or movement issues, and that's one of the things that we spoke about with dyspraxia, then trip hazards can be seriously dangerous and potentially expensive for the employer, right? There are so many things that we can consider. For every barrier that presents itself, there are things that we can do, right? People might benefit from preparing for stuff, whether that is reviews or appraisals or meetings. Again, time is free. We can give people that time. We can move stuff around. That's not an issue. Being positive as well. Positive feedback can be really helpful, yeah, and so can things like setting small achievable interim goals. That has a huge difference when it comes to someone's confidence and their self-esteem, and those are particular barriers when we're considering neurodiversity as a whole. It's going to make someone want to be part of the team, and sometimes the team might need greater awareness of what we're talking about here. So that's when stuff like training, awareness training, can definitely come into play. People can watch these webinars. That's absolutely wonderful. It's not always the same as a full dedicated course, where it can be bespoke, and that's something that I'd certainly be happy to talk to anyone about if you think that that's going to be the right option for you. Just give people the time they need. I've said it so many times. Honestly, I think it's the most important thing, because we can talk about it for hours, but both Lizzie and I could probably talk about it for hours. And there's been a lot of information in this session about conditions and strengths and challenges. But, remember that the information is general. Yeah, everyone has a different experience of their condition. And it should have given you, a solid foundation of knowledge on the topic and what you can do in the workplace to support a colleague. But the key thing is to use the knowledge to actually guide your practice and help you ask the right questions to have informed conversations. So we're going to leave you with 5 questions. Now, these 5 questions should enable you to understand, how do I apply this knowledge to support a colleague? So these are the things that you can ask. How does your condition affect you at work? You could be an expert in dyslexia and dyspraxia, but you're not necessarily an expert in how that one person lives their life. So that's a great question to ask. How can we make the most of your skills and strengths? Let's throw the positive into it. We're always talking about the challenges, the barriers, and that's why we start by talking about the positives. But if someone's only ever heard about the challenges and the barriers their whole life, if you come up with the positives, the skills, the strengths, that can have a significant impact on their self-esteem and their belief in themselves. What challenges do you experience at work? If you think it's reading and writing, what challenges does that person actually experience? And also, what changes to the way we work could help you? Let's have that open floor. Let's actually talk about it to make a difference. And finally, what do you want others to know about you and your condition? That's going to help with open lines of communication. It's going to help build a functional team, and it's going to help someone feel included. Okay. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. That was our whistle-stop tour into dyslexia and dyspraxia. Has anyone got any questions for us?
So sorry, I'm having a bit of mouse trouble, as in computer mouse, not rodent. I haven't got rodent in.
Get Tom and Jerry on the job, you'd be fine.
So that's why there's been a bit. I'll just stop sharing now. Thank you so much, as always. Thank you, and thank you to our wonderful audience as well that have been really engaged in the chat. There's been some bit of comedy going on as well, which I've enjoyed. So thank you to everyone that's taken part. We've got 4 minutes, so let's ask one question. But what I will say is, because we've had some really good questions come through, both in the Q&A and the chat, we'll definitely do a document to follow this webinar up. So it won't be ready for Monday when you get the follow-up email, but we'll work on it and send it out as a piece of content as soon as. So let me just, sorry, my naughty little mouse here. If people with dyslexia have skill sets that help them to excel in certain sectors, would it make sense to assess these sectors in a totally new way instead to maximise fairness? And that's come from Scott. Scott's been great in the audience, actually. Scott, thank you for your input in the chat. Is that something that you can answer here, or should we leave that one to the Q&A? So
No, I mean, we can certainly answer it. I was is that the Scott who sent the mouse and the cheese trap? Because if that is you, Scott, thank you. You're a legend and you have made my day. I'm totally over the olive pen situation now just because of those emojis. I agree with you in one way, but the issue is, as soon as you start having these conversations, someone will get angry about the concept of positive discrimination. It's really hard to find where that line is. The unfortunate thing at this point is we have to make our way up to the line. We have to be the ones to showcase how brilliant we are and the skills we are. And there are lots of industries. I mean, I mentioned the security services. There are lots of companies who have gone out of their way to do neurodivergent recruitment programs. So you've got Dell, HP, Goldman Sachs, they've got these neurodivergent and also autism recruitment drives as well. So the assessments there have changed across the board, though, on a sector-wide thing. I just can't see us living in a world where that would happen. So it's sad, but I can't see that happening.
Thank you. I think let's just have a quick look. Oh, just got one for you then, Lizzie. Access to Work seems to still recommend Dragon. Some people in the chat said that they've got really positive experiences with Dragon, but some people have said the opposite. So, and this person that's popped this question in, it seems a little bit dated and it's more expensive than text-to-speech apps. What is your view of it?
So I think that is a very good point. And yes, I agree. Dragon it tends to be the one that Access to Work leans toward. And I think a lot of that is based on Dragon having such a established presence as a dyslexia support. Yes, I think for some people it's ideal, especially if they've used it before, because often they've already developed the skills that you need to use Dragon in an effective way. Text-to-speech apps, I think, are fantastic. You've got things like Otter.ai, and Otter is exceptional, to be honest. And there's a free version, which is fantastic as well, because who doesn't love a free version? The paid version is less expensive than Dragon. Biggest issue with something like Otter is GDPR. So often it just does not pass security needs and guidelines in a lot of organizations. But you've also got the dictate function on Microsoft Word, which again, it's within Word. It's okay at what it does. I mean, I'm not going to say it's exceptional, and it's very much dependent on your accent as well. And for me, the one that I think is probably really high up there is TalkType. But with that comes quite a large expense, so it's a very expensive software. But TalkType has been designed in such a way that it's very good at managing accents. It's very good with the auto punctuation. Like, it is fantastic. And TalkType sometimes doesn't pass those GDPR, but it tends to pass more often than something like Otter. So it's a difficult one to answer as to what is best. It really depends on the person that you're supporting and what they are confident and comfortable with. But what I would say with access to work, right, is if you are having an access to work needs assessment and your assessor suggests Dragon and you haven't had a good experience with Dragon, please feel confident to say that to the assessor. It is not the only option. And if you unless you tell the assessor that, they're not going to know that that's not something that you find useful. So they're not going to consider like an alternative. But if you tell them there and then, I've used Dragon and it was rubbish and I found it really difficult or really clunky or whatever, then that assessor can make a decision as to whether there's an alternative that would support you better.
Brilliant. Okay, I think it's end of the webinar now, so we'll come to a close. Lots of people have said about the recording. You will get a link to the recording next week, I promise. We'll also do a Q&A follow-up, and quite a lot of people have asked about assessments, so we'll take that and get in touch with you independently. There'll also be a contact that you can, in the email, that you can get in touch with us as well if you've got any kind of questions about assessments, training, any of the stuff that the lovely Alice and Lizzie can help with. Huge thank you again, Alice and Lizzie, and a massive thank you to our audience. Please have a lovely Friday and a great weekend when it gets here. Okay, thank you.